And you talked about PA 198. We hear an awful lot these days in Michigan, but in other states as well, about businesses getting tax breaks, specific tax breaks to do developments. PA 198 was one of the first.
Yes, it was.
To attempt that and by giving businesses a tax break for locating, as I recall, mostly in cities.
No, it was any place locally. It may have started out, but it was any place that the local government wanted to grant it. And so PA 198 is a tax abatement, and it was, I mean, I know this sounds very strange because I'm not an attorney, but I did work hard in taxes. I did work hard in tax law. In some cases, the tax is a 50% cut. 50% of what? 50% of the value. It isn't a 50% cut in mills. And why is this important? Because I believed, and then I remember writing a memo about this particular act and saying it'll never hold up in court because the Constitution said that property taxes must be uniform. Well, this is 2018. It clearly is held up in court. So that's the reason I'm an economist and not an attorney.
Huh. And then you talk about the homestead tax exemption. Now, one of the big issues that has driven the state for a long time, politically as well as economically, is Michigan's property taxes.
That's correct.
And the homestead tax credit was a very dramatic decrease for many, many people in their property taxes. And it was really the first time the state tried to come up with something to help cut property taxes.
No question about it. It was a direct result of the first attempt to change school finance reform and property taxes, which occurred in 1972. When that attempt failed, and I'd like to come back to that later if we have time, but when that attempt failed, then the legislature said we have to address property tax even if we can't address school finance. And so what they did is they literally tied property taxes to income. This was a brand new concept. So they basically said that if your property taxes are too big, and how did they define too big? They said, are your property taxes greater than 3.5% of your household income? And if they were, the state would refund 60%. And for seniors, over and above a certain amount, it was 100% reimbursement. So this was a very important way of tying income and property taxes together, and ultimately was upheld as constitutional. But it was very new. And I think, again, you can agree or disagree, but the single business tax was the first one in the country for us. It's called a value-added tax, and I worked on that. The homestead property tax credit was one of the first in the country. So, I mean, I was part, even then, of some really dramatic changes. And again, I'm very proud of it, regardless of what other people think about. What a neat thing to do to be able to work on such dramatic changes.
And the man that you worked for during the development of most of those concepts, Representative Montgomery, he died a few years after you stopped working for him.
That's correct.
And you and I were talking earlier, and something very touching to you.
It did, something very touching. I worked for George Montgomery for 5 years, and I left to go work for Governor Milliken. And while I'm working I'm the deputy budget director for the state under Governor Milliken, I get a call from then Speaker Bobby Krim, who I knew very well. And the speaker called me and said, Doug, I said, Mr. Speaker, he said, I'm calling you to tell you that Representative Montgomery passed away. And I said, thank you, Mr. Speaker, I already know that. And he said, but that's not the only reason I'm calling you. He said, I'm calling you to tell you that in George's will, he asked that you be one of his pallbearers along with his grandchildren. That was the first time I thought he thought a great deal of me to put me that request. Of course I did, and I was honored to do so.
And when you went to work for Governor Milliken in the budget department, the 1970s seemed to be a period of one recession punctuated by maybe a couple of years of good economic growth going into another recession. We were starting to see the change that it is still not quite resolved in Michigan's economy from a mostly manufacturing economy to something else. What was it like working at that time you worked with?
I had various jobs in the Department of Management budget when I went over there. And before I got into the budget piece, if you don't mind, I'd like to just get it on the record that for better or for worse, I was the very first director of the Office of State Employer. That is the office that now does negotiations. It was not meant for me, and I didn't last too long. But when I went on to become the deputy budget director under Jerry Miller, who was the director of management and budget, obviously appointed. They're appointed positions by Governor Milliken.
And someone who was known by reporters under the nickname of Dr. Strange Tax.
That's true, too, and that was primarily because of the single business tax. because that's what, or Dr. No. He went under both titles. But he was an absolutely remarkable man, and I have several wonderful stories of both Jerry Miller and Governor Milliken, and maybe this is a good time to tell them. But before I go to that, I'd like to just say your point about the economy going up and down was absolutely true. That's one of the arguments for adopting a single business tax. The economy was obviously dependent heavily on automobiles, so if the autos had a good year, we had a good year. If the autos didn't, the state didn't have a good year. And sometimes it was just very, very difficult to predict exactly what was happening. I've got so many statistics, but I want to give you just one. People think about the unemployment rate. How do I put this gently? Michigan's unemployment rate relative to the U.S. Was above, the Michigan unemployment rate was higher than the U.S. for like 30 straight years. Maybe it was 28, from 1966 almost up to 1992 or 93. I mean, we were always above. Now, somebody says, well, we have a manufacturing economy. That's true. But even in good years, not all, that means every single year, good years and bad years, our unemployment rate. It was a very difficult time. And still, we dealt with it the best we could.
And you were talking about Jerry Miller. One of the things I remember during one of the recessions, one of the big recessions we had, the state was in such bad financial shape that a proposal was being worked on but never actually made that I understood that Dr. Miller looked at, and that was to basically shut half the restrooms in the Capitol complex to try to cut down on the costs of cleaning, soap, plumbing, and everything else. That sounds somewhat ridiculous, but it also is incredibly inventive.
Could be, and I was not part of it. So we had another deputy in Department of Management Budget, which was sort of head of all facilities. That may have been discussed. I was not in the room, and I can't comment on that. I do know that they tried to get rid of paper in the bathrooms to save paper towels and went to air dry, and that didn't go over real well either. So
doesn't that go to the point about you think of accounting and budgeting as rather dry subjects, but Jerry Miller was a really creative thinker in that regard, wasn't he?
Jerry Miller was wonderful. And let me just tell you a story. And I think it's a very instructive story. And the reason it is because it affected my life for the rest of. I remember I'm the deputy budget director. I go in and I say, Jerry, we have a problem. I don't, to this day, don't even remember what the problem was. And he says, okay. I tell him, he said, yep, that's a problem. And he said, what's the solution? And I said, I don't know. And he didn't smile, he didn't look, he looked right at me and he said, I don't pay you to bring me problems. I pay you to bring me solutions. Now, he didn't have to agree with it, but from then on, and frankly, for the rest of my life, if I ever went to a governor, no matter what it was, if there was a problem, I had a proposed solution. They don't have to agree with it, but at least I went with something, and that did change the way I looked at the world. And so he worked very, very hard. You got to remember that Jerry Miller was, at least at that time of Bill Milliken's administration, remember, he was governor for 14 years. This is sort of the last part of the administration. Jerry Miller was the governor's go-to person, not just for budget. I mean, almost for anything that was going on. And so being the number two person meant that there was a lot of things that were going on, and it was even though it was a rough time, it was still an extremely exciting time. And, I'm just proud to have worked for somebody like Jerry Miller, and particularly proud to have worked for somebody like Governor Milliken. And if it's okay, I'd like to go in with Bill Milliken. The time is January of 1982. It's Bill Milliken's last year. The economy is falling off the table. I don't mean declining. I mean it's falling off the table. Michigan is based on the auto industry, which at that time was Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors. They had a monopoly of the market in the United States. The sales of autos was not only falling, but the share of American cars was falling in addition. It's a double hit. We were getting cream. So Jerry goes to the governor and says, we have to cut the budget. And the governor says, okay, and we had to issue an executive order. And so it was very tough. I won't go through all the details, but we passed it. That budget was cut. 5 or 6 weeks later, Jerry Miller goes to the governor and says, we have to do it again. Bill Milliken was an incredible individual, and it's a privilege to have known him, and particularly to work for him. He never, to my knowledge, yelled at somebody. He might. I never saw him. Anyway, He was very stern with Jerry, and he said, cut more than you need. I'm not doing this again. This is a real story. Some period of time later, we didn't have enough. We're going to have to cut one more time. And Jerry Miller's in Texas, and I have to go explain this to Bill Milliken. They set up his office so that the governor's desk it was at one end of the room, and my chair was right in front, just me. And then his staff was off to the side. And it was a very difficult, do people really know what you're doing? I felt terrible. I felt that we had let such a good person down. I really felt awful. And it was very clear, it was written all over me, that I just felt terrible. And so the meeting was over, we had our orders, I was going back, and Governor Milliken comes up to me and he puts his arm around my shoulder and says, if I have to stay here, so do you. At least I knew I had a job. And I thought that that was one of the most decent things that ever happened.